Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. Please consider becoming a patron today. Simply click the link in the description below. Thank you.
People often asked Corrie ten Boom about suffering. She and her family were Christians who hid Jews. When she was asked why God had allowed such terrible things to happen, she described her life as a tapestry. We humans often only see the messy underside of loose threads. Life looks painful and confusing from our limited perspective, but God sees the other side, a bigger picture that makes sense of our mess.
In other words, Justin is taking the other side of the dilemma. Justin is not arguing that the Holocaust wasn't necessary. Justin is arguing that the Holocaust was, in fact, necessary in order for God to actualize certain greater goods. In short, in order for God to weave his beautiful tapestry.
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of When Theists Fail. Up for today is one Justin Brierley, an apologist and very successful author to boot. I must admit, and I've said this when I've mentioned Justin on the channel in the past, I really like Justin. He's clearly a very personable, friendly, and decent human being. I debated with myself as to whether or not I should feature Justin in my Most Annoying Religious People series, but I came to my senses and realised that he just wouldn't belong there. Truthfully, Justin doesn't annoy me, although his arguments can be frustrating. At the end of the day, as I've already said, he's clearly a very nice, kind, and generous human being, so I just couldn't, in good conscience or in good faith, feature him in my Most Annoying Religious People series. Maybe you'll disagree with me by the end of this video, and you'll be wagging your finger and telling me, Magic Skeptic, are you kidding me? This is so incredibly annoying. You should absolutely have put him in that other series. But as per usual, dear listener, you can be the judge. Getting back on track, what we're going to examine today is Justin's take on evil and the arguably incredibly unpleasant entailments of his view. Entailments that he perhaps doesn't realize, and so if you ever watch this, Justin, I hope that I've given you some food for thought. But with all of that said, let's not waste any more time and dive right in. I hope you enjoy it.
Why does God allow suffering? And how could this tapestry provide an answer? People often asked Corrie ten Boom about suffering. She and her family were Christians who hid Jews and helped them escape the Nazis during World War II. But Corrie's family was betrayed and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Corrie's sister Betsy died there, but somehow Corrie survived, and she used the rest of her life to teach others about forgiveness, peace, and God's love from her experience. When she was asked why God had allowed such terrible things to happen, she described her life as a tapestry. We humans often only see the messy underside of loose threads. Life looks painful and confusing from our limited perspective, but God sees the other side, a bigger picture that makes sense of our mess. He uses both the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, to weave something beautiful, just like he did with Corrie's life, just like he can with yours.
According to Justin, from God's perspective, evil plays a valuable role in creation. All evil leads to some ultimate good in the end.
He uses both the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, to weave something beautiful.
God is the one who has the heaven's eye perspective, and he can see the beautiful tapestry that's unfolding.
But God sees the other side, a bigger picture that makes sense of our mess.
We, who reside beneath the tapestry, see the loose strings and the chaotic mess.
We humans often only see the messy underside of loose threads. Life looks painful and confusing from our limited perspective.
If only we could see the tapestry from God's perspective, we would realize how our suffering leads to an ultimate good in the end. As I said at the outset, this explanation for the existence of evil entails some pretty unpalatable ideas. Justin appears to be saying that God permits the evil we endure in this world because, ultimately, said evil leads to a greater good in the long run. As Justin puts it, God sees the bigger picture, a perspective which makes sense of our mess. A picture, he suggests, that's beautiful to behold if only we could inhabit a God's eye view of the beautiful tapestry that's unfolding. In other words, despite the fact that our suffering and misery can often feel gratuitous and meaningless, Justin assures us that there's a grand plan which not only explains our pain, but in fact justifies it. In short, what appears to us like unnecessary agony is anything but, as such conclusions are rooted in our limited perspective. We are viewing the messy underside of the tapestry, a patchwork of random shapes and colours with spaghetti-like loose ends sporadically dispersed across the space. The point here is that the appearance of chaos does not entail the existence of chaos, for the messy underside of the tapestry is in fact necessary in order to produce the beauty and sophistication that resides on the surface, a view beyond our reach. Therefore, we must rest assured that any and all suffering, gratuitous though it might seem, is justified. Seems reasonable, right? Well, let's dig a little deeper, shall we? Justin uses the example of Holocaust survivor Corrie ten Boom in order to make his point. He appears to imply that God had a plan for Boom all along.
He uses both the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, to weave something beautiful, just like he did with Corrie's life, just like he can with yours.
Having survived the Holocaust, she went on to promote a message of love, compassion, and peace. Am I to interpret from this that Justin believes God permitted the Holocaust, in part at least, so that Corrie ten Boom could spread a message of love, compassion, and peace in the aftermath? So millions of people had to die in order to facilitate that trajectory for Boom. This is a difficult sell, by my lights at least. To be more precise, let's put it like this. Could God have achieved his aim of getting Corrie ten Boom to spread a message of love, compassion, and peace without recourse to the Holocaust? The answer to this question is yes or no. Either God could have achieved this aim without recourse to the Holocaust, or he couldn't. This is quite the dilemma for any theist, for no matter how they respond, there's a bitter pill to swallow. If Justin says that the Holocaust wasn't necessary in order to actualize the good of Boom spreading a message of love, compassion, and peace, then Boom's suffering at the hands of her victimizers was definitionally gratuitous, which is to say, her suffering wasn't necessary in order to produce a greater good. But if Boom's suffering is gratuitous, Justin's theodicy is debunked. The existence of gratuitous evil is incompatible with the existence of an all-powerful and an all-good God. A good being, in this context, is defined as an agent who would act to prevent evils that they have the power to prevent, all else being equal. Simply put, an all-powerful God could prevent such suffering, and an all-good God would want to. So if Boom's suffering wasn't necessary in order to produce some greater good, then her suffering is gratuitous. And if her suffering is gratuitous, your God is either not all good or not all powerful. Suffice to say, if Boom's suffering wasn't necessary in order to produce some greater good, then Justin's whole theodicy is debunked because his entire goal here is to justify the existence of evil on the grounds that it's necessary for God to weave his beautiful tapestry. But if the Holocaust wasn't necessary in order to weave this beautiful tapestry, then Boom's suffering at the hands of her victimizers isn't accounted for by Justin's theodicy. With this in mind, it should be clear that claiming that the Holocaust wasn't necessary in order to actualize the good of Boom spreading a message of love, compassion, and peace is not an option that's open to Justin, for if those goods could have been actualized without the deaths of millions, those deaths would no longer be accounted for by Justin's theodicy. And therein resides the problem for Justin and his theodicy. You see, what Justin has done is painted himself into a corner which requires that he justifies the Holocaust. Justin's theodicy requires that he offer an account and an explanation for why the Holocaust was not only permissible, but essential for God in achieving his beautiful tapestry.
He uses both the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, to weave something beautiful.
Don't let's forget, on Justin's view, our sense that evil things around us shouldn't happen is faulty. Some of these things are essential for God in the weaving of his beautiful tapestry. In other words, the Holocaust was necessary in order to actualize the good of Boom spreading a message of love, compassion, and peace. But if the Holocaust was in fact necessary in order to actualize that path for Boom, then Boom's suffering at the hands of our victimizers was, by extension, necessary. And if that's the case, in what sense was the Holocaust evil? Allow me to unpack this problem. You see, from Justin's perspective, evil is a tool that's used by God in order to actualize the greater good. Think of it like a vaccine. All else being equal, parents prefer not to hurt their children, but in the case of vaccination, we have strong countervailing reasons to hurt the child. We understand that the pain induced by the needle is worth enduring in order to acquire the immunization effect, thereby protecting the child from the disease which the vaccine inoculates against. Put another way, and counterintuitive though this phrasing might seem, in the case of vaccination, one ought hurt the child because it leads to a greater good, namely immunization. Returning to the Holocaust then, there's a bitter pill that Justin must swallow if indeed he believes that the Holocaust was necessary in order to actualize a greater good or goods. If all things considered, the Holocaust ought be done in order to actualize greater goods that only God sees from his perspective, then Justin cannot say that the Holocaust was evil. For if the Holocaust is necessary in order for God to actualize greater goods that would otherwise remain unactualized, then the Holocaust, a lot like the needle prick in the case of vaccinating the child, ought be done. Think of it this way. Assuming the Holocaust is necessary in order to actualize the greater good, then if God doesn't actualize the Holocaust, the greater goods which can only be achieved through the Holocaust will never come to pass. This, as far as I can tell, is an unavoidable conclusion of Justin's theodicy. Remember, there's only two options on the table. Either the Holocaust was necessary to God's plan, or it wasn't. If the Holocaust wasn't necessary to God's plan, this is just another way of admitting that the Holocaust was gratuitous. And that means that God either isn't all-loving or he isn't all-powerful. For an all-loving and all-powerful being would seek to remove gratuitous evil. Justin himself points out that the evils that we perceive as gratuitous aren't. They're part of the fabric of God's unfolding and beautiful tapestry.
He uses both the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, to weave something beautiful.
They only appear gratuitous to us because we reside beneath the tapestry. Were we able to view it from God's perspective, we would see that those chaotic threads, those gratuitous evils, are in fact necessary in order to weave the beautiful tapestry that is conducive to God's plan.
But God sees the other side, a bigger picture that makes sense of our mess.
In other words, Justin is taking the other side of the dilemma. Justin is not arguing that the Holocaust wasn't necessary. Justin is arguing that the Holocaust was, in fact, necessary in order for God to actualize certain greater goods. In short, in order for God to weave his beautiful tapestry. The problem for Justin, whether he realizes it or not, is that this entails that the Holocaust ought be done. If the Holocaust is necessary in order to actualize the greater goods that God wants to actualize, then the Holocaust ought be done. It's that simple. There's no way of avoiding that problem. You can't say it's necessary in order to achieve the greater good and then say that it ought not be done. For to do so is to utter a contradiction. On one hand, Justin wants us to accept the evils around us. He wants us to view them as things that ought happen because they are all conducive to weaving the beautiful tapestry that only God can see from his perspective. Yet, on the other hand, he may wish to say something like, the Holocaust ought not happen because we perceive it as gratuitous and evil. But these two views are contradictory. They stand in complete opposition to one another. Either the Holocaust should happen because it's conducive to weaving the beautiful tapestry, or it ought not happen because it's evil and gratuitous. You can't have it both ways. For what it's worth, Justin makes more or less the same point himself in another short. Have a listen.
Why does God allow suffering? This is such a hard question, and the reason it's tough is that we can't see things from God's perspective. The day our son Jeremy was born, the doctor discovered he had an infection. That meant inserting a needle into his tiny wrist to deliver the antibiotics and flush it out of his system. That night stayed with me forever. While the doctor tried to find a vein, I had to try and keep our little baby calm by feeding him drops of sugary water. But nothing could stop the fact it was a painful business. I wished I could explain to my crying newborn that the doctor wasn't being horrid, he was being helpful, that the pain of that needle was necessary, that this wouldn't last forever, that I loved him. Well, he's a happy 9-year-old now, but we are like my baby boy. We can't see the big picture and the way God may use even painful things to shape and heal us in ways we don't realise. But know this, God does see the big picture and God loves us.
As you can see, Justin tends to view evil as something that is necessary in order to achieve greater goods. It was necessary to hurt his son with the needle in order to help him, something which his son's infant brain couldn't possibly understand. However, despite this inability to understand, administering the needle and hurting his son was still necessary for the greater good. Humanity, argues Justin, is in the very same position as his son.
But we are like my baby boy. We can't see the big picture and the way God may use even painful things to shape and heal us in ways we don't realise.
We can't possibly understand why God permits the Holocaust, but he has his reasons. Ultimately, and despite our inability to understand it, the Holocaust is for the greater good. But again, doesn't this tie Justin to the idea that the Holocaust ought be done? Where's the disanalogy? Wouldn't Justin say that the needle ought be administered, despite the pain it causes, and despite his son's inability to understand why? And given that he uses this analogy to frame suffering more broadly, doesn't it straightforwardly follow that the Holocaust ought be permitted despite the pain it causes and despite our inability to understand why? To put it succinctly, what Justin is doing here is encouraging us to be skeptical about our moral indignation vis-a-vis atrocities like the Holocaust. In other words, we should think of ourselves like the infant who's receiving a needle which causes the infant pain which the infant is incapable of understanding. Yet we should rest assured that that pain has meaning and purpose, that there's a greater good to be found in the pain. Applied to the Holocaust then, the grotesque conclusion should become clear. A lot like the child who fails to understand why the needle prick is essential for the greater good, the Jews who suffered at the hands of their victimizers are simply failing to understand how their pain, suffering, and misery serves the greater good. The pain endured by victims of the Holocaust is akin to the needle prick in the vaccination case. All things considered, it ought be done, because it serves the greater good. In a sentence, and to use Justin's phrasing, the Holocaust was essential in order for God to weave his beautiful tapestry.
He uses both the good and the bad, the light and the darkness, to weave something beautiful.
If Justin rejects this, claiming instead that the Holocaust ought not be done, then he's debunking his whole video, the point of which is to suggest that evil, no matter how gratuitous it may seem, is justified from God's perspective. After all, and according to Justin, what seems unnecessary to us is, as a matter of fact, justified by God's lights, as these seemingly unnecessary evils, in actuality, contribute to the greater good. Or as Justin might put it, these seemingly unnecessary evils, in actuality, contribute to the beauty of the ever-growing tapestry. But if good is that which ought be done, a pretty reasonable definition of good if you ask me, then by God's lights, and Justin's for that matter, the Holocaust ought be done. For Justin's whole thesis is that God permits such evils in order to actualize greater goods that we can scarcely imagine given our limited perspective beneath the tapestry whose beauty is only apparent to God who resides above it. Think of it this way. If the Holocaust is necessary in order to produce some greater good or beautiful tapestry, then to prevent the Holocaust would be to interfere with God's vision for the beautiful tapestry that's unfolding, a beauty which necessitates what we perceive as unnecessary evil due to, as Justin put it, our limited perspective.
Limited perspective.
So whether Justin realizes it or not, his view entails the belief that the Holocaust ought be done. As to suggest otherwise is human hubris, born of our limited perspective beneath the tapestry.
We humans often only see the messy underside of loose threads. Life looks painful and confusing from our limited perspective.
One common attempt to escape this dilemma, as I've presented it, is to suggest that God gave humanity free will so that they could freely choose the good. God, as this solution suggests, could have created morally perfect robots, but to do so would have robbed humanity of free will, itself an evil act. Given that this would be evil, God couldn't possibly actualize such a state of affairs. Ergo, we're free. And this freedom entails the capacity to commit evil actions. Taking this into consideration, the responsibility for evil falls squarely on the shoulders of humanity. God is off the hook. Justin makes this point himself in yet another short. Have a listen.
Why would a good God allow evil? The reality is that God isn't to blame for most of the evil in the world. We are. So why doesn't God just stop us from doing bad stuff? Because we humans have been given freedom to choose between right and wrong. Imagine if God stepped in every time you ever went to do something wrong. He waved a magic wand and stopped you doing it. Well, you wouldn't be a human anymore. You'd be a robot, controlled at every turn. You wouldn't be able to choose to be kind, to do good, even to love, because you wouldn't be free. So which will it be? A world where there's no evil, but we're nothing more than robots, or a world where yes, we can choose to do wrong, but we can also choose to do right, to do good, and to love as free human beings. That's why I believe God allows evil, because he wants us to be free to choose good.
This might seem persuasive at face value, but this free will defense completely fails by Justin's own lights. Consider the fact that God has free will, yet he commits no evil. Doesn't this demonstrate that evil actions are not a necessary accompaniment of free will? Unless Justin wants to allege that God has a special kind of free will that's different from the free will he gave humanity. Leaving aside the rather obvious equivocation that's at play in such a response, I would just point out that this puts the ball back in God's court. For to respond in such a manner is to admit that God is ultimately responsible for the existence of moral evil. After all, he could have given us the special free will, which entails no moral evil, but he chose instead to give us the other type of free will, which entails the capacity to enact holocausts. Again, this makes God responsible, thereby destroying the free will defense. Consider further the mythology of heaven. Presumably, Justin believes that there's free will in heaven, for to rob agents of free will in heaven would be to commit an immoral action against them, a definitional impossibility for both heaven and God. So there must be free will in heaven, yet there's no moral evil in heaven. This means that agents can be free and always choose the good, according to Christian theology at the very least. Please notice that this isn't a position that I'm articulating. All I'm drawing your attention to here is a tension that exists within Justin's worldview. On one hand, he's telling us that moral evil is the price of free will.
The reality is that God isn't to blame for most of the evil in the world. We are.
Yet, Justin believes in heaven, a place where there's free will, and yet there exists no moral evil. So evidently, and by Justin's lights, free will can exist without the necessary accompaniment of moral evil. Suffice to say, God can actualize a world where agents are free and evil doesn't exist. Given that this is possible, God's failure to actualize this world is his responsibility, not ours. In short, and once again, this makes God ultimately responsible for moral evil, thereby destroying the free will defense. So in summary, the problem is this. Any theist who wishes to construct a greater goods theodicy must confront a simple dilemma. Horn one of this dilemma is to acknowledge that at least some evils are gratuitous, thereby debunking the greater goods theodicy before it even gets off the ground. Horn 2 of the dilemma is to suggest that evil is necessary for God to actualize a greater good or goods, in which case the evils in question ought be done, i.e. they are good. So which is it, Justin? Is the Holocaust gratuitous, or ought the Holocaust be done? Those are your options. Pick your poison.